The vibes may be bad in Atlanta coming off their Week 7 loss to the 49ers, but they feel like they're a lot worse for the Miami Dolphins.
You are Locked On NFL Crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to a crossover Thursday, which is presented by PrizePicks. Make sure you download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. Yes, it is a crossover Thursday for this Week 8 matchup between the Atlanta Falcons and Miami Dolphins. I am, of course, your humble host, Aaron Freeman of Locked On Falcons, and I am joined by the illustrious host of the Locked On Dolphins podcast. That is none other than Kyle Krabs. We appreciate each and every one of you that are everydayers of our respective shows. And of course, that means you make each of these shows, Locked On Falcons, Locked On Dolphins, your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer, if you haven't already started that, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So, of course, today's Crossover Thursday presented by PrizePicks. We will be breaking down this Week 8 matchup between these two teams. We'll talk about keys to victory, big matchups that intrigue us, some injury updates. But we'll start this thing with the biggest stories. But before we get into that, Kyle, I know the vibes in Miami aren't doing great for the Miami Dolphins, but how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing fine. I'm living the dream, right? We get to talk about football for a living. I get to see folks like yourself. We don't do this very often, right? Some of these crossovers, I got to see Joe Marino 2-3 times a year. I see him every day, but it's a separate show. So it's good to catch up with you in particular and enjoying the chance to kind of catch up on a team that has a lot of players that I like. I love Raheem Morris as a coach, so I'm excited to kind of hear from you on what's vibing with Atlanta. Obviously, tough loss to San Francisco where it kind of got the offense bottled up, but you got a little bit of get-right opportunity here with Miami coming to town. So we'll get into all the matchups and stuff like that, but first and foremost, it's great to catch up with you.
Well, Kyle, you hold a special place in my heart because the very first crossover I did when we got on YouTube was with you for that game back in 2021 where Kyle Pitts went off against that Dolphins secondary. So I do recall that one being a great time. But yeah, it has been a while for us to catch up.
Yeah, and lots changed for both of these teams since the last time we had a chance to do a crossover. And for Miami, they had a whole competitive cycle that opened and closed since we last did a crossover. And that's kind of where Miami sits right now, where every game feels like you're walking in wondering how bad does it get, and if it gets bad enough, do we wake up on Monday and the other shoe drops? And it kind of felt like Sunday against the Browns could maybe be that day, where the reports continue to suggest that owner Stephen Ross, he doesn't want to fire Mike McDaniel. He likes Mike McDaniel. He wants to try to give it a chance to have the team stabilize and come back around in what was pretty well established to be a transitional year as far as the offseason for talent that goes out and not spending a bunch in free agency, but being a little bit more focused on some of the meat and potatoes positions with the trenches, where they overhauled the guard position, they overhauled defensive tackle, and it just hasn't clicked. And then you lose in Cleveland, where you have a bunch of self-inflicted penalties. You have 4 turnovers. Quarterbacks are dropping the snap in the rain, just basic stuff, right? And it's alarming for it to be year 4 of an offense, even with the injuries that exist, and Tyreek Hill's out for the year. And to the right side of your offensive lineman's been out since week 2. But it's alarming that all of the little things that continue to snowball on a team that's had continuity within the system. And I think that's the biggest alarming thing for Dolphins fans. And you go up to Cleveland and lose to a team that hadn't scored more than 17 points in like 10 months, and you give up 31. But lo and behold, nothing changes, and on we ride another week. And 4 days after this game, the Dolphins have to play host to the Baltimore Ravens, trying to climb out of a slow start and hold their own. So be a quick turnaround for Miami on the other side of this game. So I don't think this is like the fire the coach watch game because of the short turnaround after the fact, but the urgency for Miami to push some right buttons and figure some stuff out is at an all-time high.
Yeah, and you mentioned the slow start that Miami has, and I know you've talked about this on Locked On Dolphins recently, how they have a habit in recent years of starting slow and then kind of turning things around in the back half of the season. And so they're kind of waiting for their get right game. And, for the Locked On Falcons listeners, hearing the terms get right game, sends a cold shiver up their spine, just because the Falcons habitually are kind of the get right game for a lot of teams historically. I'm hoping that changes, particularly this season and this week, but we've already seen a couple of games, primarily those losses on the road against Carolina and last week against San Francisco, where both of those teams were kind of in a funk a little bit. San Francisco most recently not being able to run the football and then having a field day against a very poor Falcons run defense. So hopefully the Falcons can avoid, that sort of get right opportunity for this Dolphins team that's looking for any type of spark to get their season back on track. And I think the key for the Falcons is going to be, can they get a better performance from their quarterback and Michael Penix, who's dealing with an injury this week. Full disclosure, we're recording this before the injury report drops on Wednesday, so we don't quite know what his status is. It's been labeled a bone bruise to some part of his lower body. Some people said it was a foot, and some people said it was an ankle, and then no one really quite knows exactly what part of his what part of his leg got injured, but he suffered it late in the 49ers game, and it led to some very poor accuracy. Penix already had kind of issues with his mechanics being a little inconsistent, the footwork type stuff that leads to him maybe spraying some throws that he maybe shouldn't. And that got kind of exacerbated late in the game due to this injury. And so the concern right now is if he's dealing with that injury heading into this Sunday, will that lead to him, struggling a little bit more than what we've seen at times this season. But I think the Falcons are just kind of hope, let's just give the ball to Bijan and maybe not make this a thing. So we'll see if the Falcons can successfully accomplish that.
Yeah, and it's a bad matchup for Miami because they are prone to explosives. They've kind of been incrementally getting better at some of the down by down gap integrity, but even last week against the Browns, it was a 46-yard run up the gut to Quinshon Judkins where you got three guys' hats in the same gap on the backside of the play. And you get some movement on a double team up the B gap, and you're through the second level with momentum. And this is not the running back that you want to do that with. And I think that's where, if Atlanta's focus is we want to play a lower stress game for the quarterback. I mean, the Browns just did that last week in adverse weather and had success with it because they could just kind of bided their time for Miami to shoot themselves in the foot and implode. And the Dolphins happily obliged in the second quarter. And I think that the Falcons would be wise to be mindful of what that game script was like and act accordingly.
Yeah. And so we will get more into some of these matchups, including, how Bijan and some of these other Falcons skill players look and match up against this Dolphins defense as we continue today's Crossover Thursday presented by PrizePicks. This episode is presented by PrizePicks, the daily fantasy app, where making the right call can actually pay off. You and I make decisions every day, but on PrizePicks, being right means cashing in. With football being back, PrizePicks is the simplest and easiest way to get in on the action. It's very fast. You just pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you can turn your takes into real prizes in less than 60 seconds. And PrizePicks just recently added stacks, so if you want to ride one player, you can select their pass yards, rush yards, and touchdowns all in one lineup. So download the PrizePicks app today. Use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 in lineups after your first $5 play. PrizePicks, it's good to be right. And today's episode is also presented by Game Time. We know that there's nothing better than getting into the stadium, being surrounded by fans, and cheering on your favorite team. And, getting tickets can be a hassle, whether it's the login screens, the queues, and the prices jumping at checkout. It can be frustrating. And that's why you got to use Game Time, right? The app that gives the advantage back to the fans. It's fast, it's easy, it's backed by the Game Time guarantee. You'll always get 100% authentic tickets delivered on time at the best price. Plus, all fees are included. So the price you see is the price you pay. And speaking of what you see is what you get, is we love those panoramic seat views so you can preview the exact spot you'll be watching Bijan Robinson or Tagovailoa or Devon Achan, bust off these big plays this Sunday. And, if you're trying to head up I-75, if you're a Dolphins fan to Atlanta from Miami, make sure you use Game Time to take the guesswork out of buying tickets. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. And that $20 that you save with Game Time is going to go a long way to concessions in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. So check it out. Terms apply. Again, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Game Time today. So we are continuing today's crossover Thursday presented by PrizePicks with myself, Aaron Freeman of Locked On Falcons, Kyle Krabs of Locked On Dolphins. Let's get into some of these key matchups, Kyle. And you mentioned one with Bijan Robinson going up against this Dolphins defense that has struggled at times with gap integrity. I'm looking at these matchups, Kyle, and I like all of the Falcons skill position players, whether we're talking about Bijan, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, Darnell Mooney, potentially against this Dolphins defense that has struggled this upcoming season. And I guess I'll give you the floor to tell me, which of these matchups are you most fearful going up against this Dolphins defense? And that will be the matchup that, potentially heading on over to PrizePicks this weekend, and those more or less projections that I'll be hammering in terms of, yards and points and touchdowns and all that sort of things. But sort of when you look at this Falcons offense, do you have a bigger concern going up against this Dolphins defense?
Yeah, I think some of the variance at quarterback kind of cools me a little bit on just how much of a mismatch I think Drake London is for them. I think the world of Drake London, but if you have some inaccurate spray chart stuff at quarterback, and Miami, if they want to play that game and play it real tight, maybe you hit some shots down the field. But I do think the Bijan Robinson element of this, both in the run game and in the pass game, right, with how dynamic he's been, averaging 13 yards a catch in the pass game. I know he's had a couple of explosive catch and run opportunities, and that's been a spot for Miami that, they haven't covered it well. They have not covered the middle of the field with consistency because their linebackers, it's either KJ Britt, who's very familiar with Atlanta from his time with Tampa Bay, but he's more of a plug type player. And he started 2 weeks ago because Tyrell Dotson was in concussion protocol, and then Dotson came out of concussion protocol and was back in the game. And he doesn't have an overly attractive passing game profile as a defender either. So it's the middle of the field stuff with you're down to like your fifth option at nickel, where Minkah Fitzpatrick effectively lives in the nickel now because Cater who's out for the year, and then you cut Mike Hilton, and then Jason Marshall went on IR after 3 games as a rookie who had never played nickel before, but week 2 of the preseason, now he's the starting nickel for the team. He did have his 21-day activation window was activated on Wednesday. Now, whether that means he will be good to go to dress for the game is a different story, but it's those matchups in the middle of the field where I think you can kind of play the numbers game on the outside. And if you're going to force more low percentage throws down the field, Drake London is as good as anybody at winning those. But I think Rasul Douglas has been one of the few bright spots for Miami, and he's not a guy that runs a 4-3 or anything like that. So you probably have to bake in some help over the top, but I think he can at least hold his own, where I look at Bijan and what he's capable of and all the ways in which he can impact the game. All it takes is 2-3 pops, right? And now you're looking at a 175-yard day, and I think he's more than capable of that, and the Dolphins have shown themselves very prone to that.
Absolutely. So I think the best solution for the Dolphins, if they don't want Bijan or any of these Falcon skilled players to go off in the ways that they could, is to make sure that Michael Penix can't get the ball out by putting him on his back. And so I think the one matchup that does worry me a little bit for the Falcons offense is the Falcons offensive tackles going up against these Dolphins edge rushers and Jaylen Phillips, Bradley Chubb, Chop Robinson. I know he's not off to the start that probably a lot of Dolphin fans expect him to do from a production standpoint, but he's kind of, if he can get back to converting speed to power as effectively as he did as a rookie, that could be very potent, particularly going up against Elijah Wilkinson, the Falcons replacement for the injured Caleb McGarry, who's out for the season at right tackle, who's been very susceptible to bull rushes, really struggled last week against Bryce Huff. Jake Matthews dealing with a ankle sprain, so he's not 100%. So that could create some problems for him against Bradley Chubb, a little bit more than maybe you would expect if Jake was 100% going into this game. So I feel like that's going to be the key for the Dolphins. If they can just kind of put pressure on Penix, that will kind of limit his ability to be able to attack down the field. But obviously, if he has to get rid of the ball quickly and check the ball down to Bijan, that's still a thing that I think, favors the Falcons potentially if you get Bijan 1-on-1 in the open field against pretty much anybody in the NFL.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the matchups that Miami had against the Chargers, where Rashawn Slater's out for the year. Joe Alt didn't play in the game. Their swing tackle didn't play. And you saw them have success on the edges in that element to kind of heat up the pass opportunities, but they haven't really found the complementary rush up the middle to be able to box. So they've had a lot of success with those types of matchups, forcing the quarterback off of his initial drop point, but there's enough space for them to step up in the pocket or to get up and out in the B gap. Or if the edge guy tries to duck inside, then you're giving up the contain and you get outside the pocket and you can extend in that regard. So if the Dolphins are going to make the most of that matchup, a lot of these young guys that they have playing, they have two rookies that are playing significant snaps between Kenneth Grant and Jordan Phillips. They both have over 200 snaps defensively already through the first 7 weeks. Them plus Zach Sealer, those guys have to be the best that they have been to make sure when those edge guys do win those matchups, they're able to get those guys down to the ground.
Now, flipping the side of the ball, looking at this Dolphins offense going up against this Falcons defense, I do think because of the injury to Divine Diablo, who had been playing outstanding through the first several games, he's down with a forearm injury, I believe a broken forearm, so he's going to miss a couple of games coming up. The Falcons lose a lot of speed over the middle of their defense. We know that that's an area of the field where the Dolphins like to attack. And you have a lot of speedy guys. I know no Tyreek Hill, but Devon Achane and Jaylen Waddle still can outrun a lot of people and a lot of people on the Falcons defense. And so you get JD Bertrand now replacing Divine Diablo. I think if the Dolphins can kind of try to find ways to get him exposed in the open field, that could be very lucrative for this Dolphins offense and a favorable matchup for them on offense. But for you, when you look at this Dolphins offense going up against this Falcons defense, do any matchups kind of sort of stand out for you?
Well, I'm admittedly a little green with envy here because I love Xavier Watts coming out and I love Billy Bowman coming out, and you guys got both of them. I love Jalen Walker coming out. You guys got him too. So this draft class for Atlanta, obviously making some big waves here early on with some of the impact plays that they've had. It's all Mike McDaniel to push the right buttons and create the right misdirections and eye candy to take advantage of some of those young guys, right? And if they're as speedy as what this front is capable of being, getting them to bite on the eye candy and taking advantage of that speed with misdirection type stuff, I think is really essential for this game for Miami. And they've started to do some stuff like that where they flirted with having 3-4 guys kind of in the offensive backfield at the same time, almost like the modern spread pistol version of like your wing tee offense, where you got this guy's going this way and this guy's going this way, and there's a toss action that could be to either one of them. So I think that the run scheme elements for McDaniel have to shine here, because this is the kind of defense where you look at it and you see we got a lot of athleticism, we got a lot of aggressiveness, but some of the key guys that play in space are young. And I think that for me is the matchup that means the most for Miami in this game.
Yeah. We'll see, which of these teams can most take advantage of these matchups. With the Falcons being at home, I have the audacity to be optimistic for once here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. So we will talk more about some of these big keys to victory for both of these teams. How can the Dolphins get their season back on track and walk away with a win? How can the Falcons try to regain some of that momentum they had a few weeks ago off of a 2-game win streak, including a big win against the Buffalo Bills on Monday night? We'll be breaking all of that down as we wrap up today's Crossover Thursday, presented by PrizePicks. Today's episode is also brought to you by Mazda, who craft cars for those who do more than simply move. Whether it's footwork all the way to breath work, we know that athletes sweat every detail. Mazda brings the same intention to how we craft every model of car, SUV, and vehicle. You can feel it with the Japanese craftsmanship in every detail, from the metallic accents all the way to the available Napa leather upholstery. And you can make everyday drives feel like anything but. From smooth handling to intuitive controls, with the all-wheel drive standard in every crossover SUV, you can drive with confidence through almost any season, including football season. So like our players, we sweat every detail, because when you make every move count, impossible becomes irrelevant. Mazda, move and be moved. So wrapping up today's Crossover Thursday, presented by PrizePicks, myself, Aaron Freeman of Locked On Falcons, Kyle Krabs of Locked On Dolphins. Kyle, let's get into some of these keys to victory, and I'll give you the floor, my friend.
Yeah, I think Miami, Darren Waller was placed on injured reserve on Wednesday. They put Greg Dulcich up to take his spot on the roster. The personnel grouping that they'd, of course, had the most success with was 22 personnel, with 2 backs and 2 tight ends, where they went a little heavy in life after Tyreek Hill. Do they try to do that? How ready is Greg Dulcich to do that? He was picked up off the waiver wire on August 28th, so he's been in-house for almost 2 months on the practice squad. What is he ready to do? I think that is a really important piece of this for Miami, because if it's Tanner Connor, who's been a pet project for 4 years within the system, and he's just going to take the Darren Waller reps, you're not going to see a lot of 22 personnel, and they're not going to put a lot of 2 tight ends on the field. So that for me is the first one that stands out, is what do you do to get more size and athleticism on? Because when you've been at your best, it's when you've been able to present size challenges and maybe put teams into base or put teams into nickel. And then if they stay in nickel, then you could try to big boy them. And that parlays into the next key to victory to me, which is taking advantage of what this rush defense for Atlanta has been the last, 3-4 weeks, where Washington goes for 147, Buffalo goes for 134, and San Francisco goes for 174. Miami has too often, for a team that's run by a coach that has a run game coordinator background, not been invested enough in finding and sustaining that success. And I think if they're going to win with Tua Tagovailoa in a streak in which he's been very poor with the ball security, there's been some poor decisions in there, you have to take that stress off of him, that time off of under tension off for him. And he's got to be able to make sound decisions. You do that by winning the early downs and running the ball with consistency. So that's my second key to victory. And then I'll take the low-hanging fruit in the last one, which is you got to bow up in the red zone. And I know that that's an area for Atlanta they don't measure particularly well statistically through the first 6 games that they've played this season. They're 29th in touchdown percentage in the red zone offensively, and they're 32nd in the NFL in red zone defensive percentage, but they've only had 11 trips into the red zone defensively. So that's for Miami. That goes into some of your personnel stuff, but that also goes into, if you're going to play bend, don't break, when the field compresses, that's when you really have to force Atlanta to kick some field goals and make sure that if you lose the score on possession percentage battle, Atlanta's only getting 3 if you're getting 7 a few times.
Yeah, we'll see if the Falcons can sort of resurrect their red zone, woes, I guess you could say. That's one of the keys to victory for me, is just like the Falcons need to be better in the red zone when they get those opportunities to score. They need to be able to put 7 on the board. Too often they have been settling for 3 at times this season. And so, my second key to victory is, get this offense off to a fast start. And I think this week that means a commitment to running the football with Bijan Robinson and trying to get him going. This offense's foundation, their identity is, the Bijan-driven offense. Pretty much everything they do is devoted to maximizing his ability. They weren't quite able to do that last week against the 49ers. And so I expect them to make a commitment to doing that this week against the Dolphins. And as we've already discussed, that should lead to some success or great success for this Falcons offense. And then the last thing is kind of the cliche. You got to win the turnover battle. If you're the Falcons, that helps you tremendously. I think I looked up the stat, and under Raheem Morris, when the Falcons have a positive turnover margin, they're 8-0. When they have a negative turnover margin, they're 1-8. And when it's an even turnover margin, they're 2-4. So basically, if as long as they get more takeaways than giveaways, they're going to win the game up to this point. And we've seen Tua Tagovailoa throw a lot of interceptions this year. I watched all of them earlier today. A lot of them are just, underneath linebackers seem to really give Tua some problem. They seem to be, predators that are in their cloaking device, and they just sort of, materialize and then all of a sudden snatch an interception. So hopefully with Xavier Watts, as you mentioned, Jesse Bates, these guys are known to take the ball away. We'll see if Billy Bowman's back this week as a nickel corner. He's been out the last 2 weeks dealing with some injuries. But hopefully, Caden Ellis got an interception last week. Hopefully JD Bertrand will be able to take advantage of the gifts that Tua likes to give. We're not quite in the holiday season quite yet, at least in Halloween.
Yeah, get some candy on Halloween, right?
Yeah, so let's do some trick-or-treating, I guess you could say, when it comes to these gifts of some of these turnovers. Get some of those turnovers, and then again, going back to just like, hey, Michael Penix been pretty good about not turning the ball over, and especially should be even better not turning the ball over if all he has to do is hand the ball off to Bijan, and that's a successful formula for success for this Falcons offense.
For sure. I'm looking forward to this game and kind of picking up the aftermath I'll be tuning into Locked On Falcons after the game for sure. And any Falcons fans that want to hear potentially another crash out on Locked On Dolphins, swing over after the fact, and we'll have you covered.
We'll see. Again, we'll see about that, Kyle. But 7.5 point favorites for the Atlanta Falcons as of this recording over at FanDuel. It sounds like you feel like it's a pretty good odds that the Falcons will cover that spread. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. It's too many mistakes for Miami, too much sloppy football, and Atlanta is obviously a different team when they're playing at home right now, so they have that working for them as well.
So we will see if the Falcons cover. Go check it out at FanDuel. Of course, go check out PrizePicks. And, of course, continue to make Locked On Falcons and Locked On Dolphins your first listen. We'll have you covered all the way up to Sunday on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And, of course, for your second listen, if you haven't got your football fix by listening to this crossover Thursday, make sure you check out Locked On NFL, 2 shows daily. You get that shot of espresso from Tyler Rowland, and then head on over to the Barbershop with Tony Wiggins to give you all the big stories each and every day across the NFL. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.